not allow evil to exist. Okay, it's Satan, it's the God of this world, it's not the true God. But why does the true God not get rid of Satan? The first thing we looked at is how the true God uses Satan for his purposes. To keep us out of trouble, to deal with our old nature, necessarily, when required, our sin. Why do Christians seem to have such a difficult time in this world, while the unsaved can so often seem to have such a good time? They're not living on the enemy's territory. We are. And of course, they're being lured into a trap. The things that go wrong in our lives, the fiery ordeals, are not just opposition from Satan, but again, it's something that God uses to keep us from trusting and hoping in this world. The more blessings, the more vulnerable we become to pride, self-sufficiency, and hoping in this life. Hence, the Lord will even use buffets of the enemy, thorns of Satan. Secondly, we'll be coming to that in a moment, the deeper theology of wickedness and its destruction. But we looked at the Jewish understanding, Yetzir hara v'yetzir hatov, the natural propulsion or propensity for good and evil, the conflict found in all of us. But this is true of the saved and the unsaved. The difference being the saved have the capacity not to go and not to reject or to crucify the Yetzir hara, the unsaved do not. And again, when you deal with Jewish people, if there's a God, or if Jesus is the Messiah, he's the Prince of Peace, how come the bomb blew up outside, dropped the gate, and killed 45 people? Well, read Leviticus 26, read Deuteronomy 28, read Deuteronomy 18. It's the curse of the Torah. The Messiah would not come to bring worldwide peace. Wars and desolations are determined to the end in Daniel 9. In his return, he'll bring worldwide peace. Right now, he gives peace to the hearts of those who repent and receive him. The only way he could bring in worldwide peace is to remove the things which cause for the peace not to be there, and that is the human race, whom he's giving a chance to repent, beginning with Israel and the Jews. But let's go on now to our second reason. The first reason we looked at was God uses Satan for his purposes. To keep us on the straight and narrow, to keep us humble, to stop us from trusting in this world, etc. But now we get into the deeper theology of wickedness and its destruction. Once again, look at Job chapter 1, verses 9 to 12. Then Satan answered the Lord, "Does Job fear God for nothing? You think he just loves you because he loves you? Hast thou not made a hedge about him, and his house, and all he has on every side, that thou hast blessed the work of his hands, and his possessions have increased in the land? But put forth thy hand now, and touch all he has, he will surely curse thee." Then the Lord said to Satan, "Behold, all he has is in your power, only do not put your hand on him." Satan wanted God to smite Job. God says, "No, I'm not going to smite Job, but I'll let you do it, up to a certain point." The Lord will never allow us to endure more than we can. Certainly with temptation will provide the way to escape. Now King David wrote, "I've never seen the wicked perish for lack of bread." I have no doubt in his life and in his experience that was true. And in a spiritual sense, a lack of the Word of God, that's also true. We have the testimonies of believers who were in prison for their faith, had no Bible, but the Holy Spirit spoke to them directly. Yet, one of the areas in Ethiopia most devastated by famine was an area where you had a high concentration of Christians and among them a high concentration of born-again Christians. You look through church history, before the Reformation, the true believers, the Waldensians in Europe, they and their children died of exposure and hunger, being persecuted by the Roman Catholic Church. They fled to the Alps and they died. Normally, that won't happen to believers. But there have been exceptional circumstances where it has. Still, the Lord will never allow us to endure more than we can take. It may be more than we think we can take. It may be more than we think we can take. But as Job discovers, God knows his limitations. Now you have to be careful when you read the book of Job. 90% of what his friends told him was true, wasn't it? It was the 10% that wasn't true that contaminated the rest. What's it say in Proverbs? A little folly lays to waste much wisdom. 90% of what they said was true. And Job says, think you're the only one who knows these things? You're not telling me that you know something that I don't know? I'm not inferior to you, says Job. There's nothing you have to say. There's nothing you're saying that's true that I couldn't tell you. Job 13, verse 2. What you know, I also know. I'm not inferior to you. When you're going through trials and people come, instead of counseling you or comforting you, they try to counsel you. They try to lecture to you and tell you what's wrong with you. And they tell you stuff you already know, as if you're a new Christian or as if you're a child. You ever see that happen? That happens, doesn't it? Sure happened to Job. Now, I'm not dismissing wise counsel and advice, but the ministry of encouragement and empathy and genuine pastoral ministry is not like Job's friends. But so often when Christians are under affliction, the kind of support they get from other Christians is the kind of support they can do without. They get the same kind of encouragement that Job got from his friends. 90% of it was religious claptrap that he already knew, and 10% of it was just false. Encouragement, real pastoral ministry, real wisdom, absolutely. But the only real wisdom Job got was what he got directly from God, wasn't it? Wasn't what he got from his friends. Job prayed for his friends, though. He didn't get angry at them, did he, at the end? Nonetheless, let's look at this. Satan accuses man. Job chapter 2, verses 2 to 6. And the Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? And Satan said, from roaming about on the earth, walking to and fro. And he still does. The Lord said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? There's no one like him on the earth, a blameless and upright man, fearing God, turning away from evil. He still holds fast his integrity, although you incited him against me to ruin him without cause. So Satan brings all this calamity and adversity upon Job, and Job doesn't lose his faith, and then Satan says, skin for skin. Yes, all this man has he will give for his life. However, put forth thy hand now and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse thee. So the Lord said to Satan, he's in your power, only spare his life. Again, God would not hurt his children, would he? He would not hurt his people. God would not do it himself, but he allowed the devil to do it. Up to a point. Never more than we can handle. There is no situation anyone will face when the grace will not be there to deal with it. Think of Corrie ten Boom. How could she do what she did? She said when she was a little girl and they would get on the train, the father would give her the ticket when it was time to get on the train. not before it was time to get on the train in Harlem to go up to Amsterdam would he give her the ticket. You don't know what you can go through until you have to do it. No, right now, you and I couldn't go through certain things. I hope we never have to. But if we do, even though we can't go through it now, if the time comes, I promise you the grace will be there. Now, this accusation that Satan brings against Job is not the beginning. He is none other than the one the scriptures tell us is the accuser of the brethren. Now let's look at Proverbs 13:24 first of all. Also in the wisdom literature. He who spares his rod hates his son, but he who loves him corrects him diligently. Again, God is not the father of the unsaved. George Carey is wrong. The Hebrew word here is musar. It's only his children he's interested in correcting. Hebrews 12:3-11. For consider him who has endured such hostility by sinners against himself, so that you may not grow weary and lose heart. You've not resisted to the point of shedding blood in your striving against sin. And you've forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the correction of the Lord, nor faint when you are corrected by him. For those whom the Lord loves he corrects, and he scourges every son whom he receives. It doesn't mean literally beats, but it means corrects. It is for correction that you endure, for God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there whom his father does not correct? But if you are without correction, of which all have become partakers, then you are illegitimate children and not sons. Furthermore, we had earthly fathers who corrected us, and we respected them. Shall we not much rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they corrected us for a short time as seemed best to them. But he corrects us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. All correction for the moment seems not to be joyful, but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been trained by it, afterwards it yields the peaceful fruit of righteousness. When the Archbishop said this guy who murdered these kids was our brother, that was sick. If a Christian was into watching child pornography on videos, God would deal with them. He corrects his children. But there's another danger. Sometimes we think that whenever we are under affliction, it must of necessity be correction. Fair point. Yes, God uses this to deal with us. Revelation chapter 3, verse 19. Those whom I love, I reprove. Therefore be zealous and repent. That is true. May the Lord deal with the things that are wrong in my life and yours before we stand before him. May he deal with our lives now. No matter how crummy our life might be in this world, it's better to have him deal with it now than to go the way of those who walk into the Malkodet, the trap. May we appear before the throne, the bima, not the thronos, the judgment seat of grace, of mercy, of reward, not of condemnation. Two different Greek words. Nonetheless, there becomes the problem. Misconceptions sometimes creep in. The first is when things go wrong, when we're going through trials or valleys, or when we are under affliction. And affliction is a state like Job was in. You're afflicted and God lets it happen. You have believers with illnesses that they just don't get healed from, and the Lord does not heal them. Other people get healed, but they don't get healed. There are different reasons for affliction and reasons it happens. It is wrong to necessarily think that means there must be something wrong with you that God is trying to deal with. True, as Job says, none of us can stand before him, and because we're human, we have no reason to complain. There was a literal Adam and a literal Eve, but a literal Adam and a literal Eve were figures of us. In other words, if God created myself and my wife instead of Adam and Eve, we would have done the same things they did, and in fact affirmed their sin by our own lives. We have no right to complain. And even though that may be so, and even though God will use trials, difficult circumstances to correct us, affliction is something different. When a Christian is in affliction, it is not correction. When a Christian is being afflicted, it's not, in any primary sense at least, to do with correction. We have to understand the difference between correction and affliction. Job experienced affliction. There was nothing wrong with him that God was trying to deal with, except in the general sense that he was fallen, but there was no specific thing in his life. Affliction is one thing, correction is another. When a believer is in a state of affliction, like Job, they normally do not understand it and will not understand it except in retrospect. I knew a case, a young woman, kid really, I guess 20 or something like that, in New York, and she was young, and she went all over the United States, from one hospital to another, trying to get cured of a terrible disease. She had all kinds of prayer, all kinds of everything, every kind of ministry imaginable. And just went from doctor to doctor, hospital to hospital, never got better. She was only a kid, but I believe she was from a family of believers, and she was a strong believer even as a young person. That woman, young woman, was under affliction. She didn't understand it at the time. I didn't understand it at the time. And she was always in hospitals with people who had diseases from which there was little or no hope of recovery. People who were despondent. People who lost their hope. People who knew they weren't going to get better. People who knew they would die prematurely. Who can those people receive the gospel from? A Christian under affliction. The story I always think of, and I've said it a number of times, and it's one that has always stuck in my mind. Richard Wurmbrand is, of course, a Romanian Jew. Him and Sabina, they know my wife. They speak to each other in Romanian and that. And he tells the story about the Romanian peasant, again, who was in prison, only for his faith. He was arrested and put in a communist prison in a room maybe the size of this one, a little smaller, with 30, 40 other people who were repeatedly tortured and beaten. Repeatedly. And there was a scientist who was in prison for the only crime that he did not join the party. He was not a communist. That was the only thing they put him in prison for. And Ceausescu did not like intellectuals or scientists who were not party members, so the guy went in prison. That made him a traitor. And this peasant was there because he believed in Jesus. And the scientist would mock the peasant, and people were dying every day. I didn't know if they were going to be dead the next day. And the scientist mocked the peasant, said to him, "Why are you always singing and praying and smiling? What are you happy about? You're Jesus. Look what he's done for you. How can you believe in Jesus?" And he just mocks him. Do you talk to Jesus? What happens when you talk to him? Does he talk back to you? Yes, he talks back to me. What does he say to you?
Did he tell you he loves you? Oh, yes, he tells me he loves me every day. And what happens when he talks to you? Does he smile? Oh, yeah, he smiles. The scientist says, Matam. And what does he look like when he smiles? And the peasant says, looks like this. And the peasant smiles, and the Shekinah glory comes on the peasant. And the scientist falls down and begins pounding his fist on the ground. You've seen Jesus Christ. And gave his life to the Lord. Again, Corrie ten Boom in the concentration camp. Rose Wormer in Auschwitz. A Jewish woman who believed in Jesus and could in Hungary have used her belief in Jesus, her Christian faith, to escape Auschwitz, and God told her to go into it. Not many Jews came out alive. She's one of the few who did, but she didn't know she was coming out alive. She thought she was going to, and she went in. When you're in affliction, it's like Job. You see, correction, you pretty well get the gist of it. God's using this to work something out of my life. Affliction, you don't understand it at the time. In retrospect, maybe you'll understand it. Maybe. Job, he's not told why this was happening to him. We're told in the book of Job, but he himself was not told. Not that we have a record of in the text. We should not confuse correction with affliction. Yes, there is correction, and that's one reason God allows this evil to go on. But then there's affliction. Affliction is something which is difficult to discern. The wisdom of man cannot normally answer it. When men try to answer philosophically, even when Christians try to answer the issue of affliction, they wind up talking the way Job's friends did. Do you know what I mean? It's a thing that can only be discerned by the Spirit when God shows it. You won't understand it in the circumstances necessarily. Who knows, maybe it won't even be understood this side of eternity. I don't know, but Job was not told. When a Christian is under affliction, the last thing they need is somebody to come along and give them religious lectures. But that's usually what they get. Now, if someone is under affliction, that should not be confused with correction. Now, there's another error. And I wish to preface this by pointing out my profound respect and gratitude in the Lord for those I'm going to mention. There's one person's books I recommend reading. It's The Chinese Believer, Watchman Nee. I agree with 95% of what Watchman Nee wrote. As a young believer, I was extremely edified by his books. But there are certain points where I profoundly disagree, and in fact, I'm positive he was wrong. Now, if somebody like him can get it wrong sometimes, where does that put somebody like me? Please never take my word for anything. Be a Berean. You take it to the Lord and you search the Scriptures for yourselves. Watchman Nee said in The Spiritual Man that if a believer was going to be in God's will, he had to accept whatever God's will was, joyfully. And if it was God's will for the believer to suffer, the believer would gladly suffer. That is not biblical. Some think on certain points he was influenced by certain Chinese or Eastern philosophical ideas, and he may have been. This mortification thing is a Roman Catholic idea because of the Roman Catholic guilt. The blood of Christ does not take away all sin. You have to atone for your own, purgatory, and the rest of it. So it's a Roman Catholic idea of the joy of suffering, this religious masochism. It's unnatural to want to suffer. The Bible never calls us to be unnatural. It calls us to be supernatural. Oh Lord, let me suffer. That is perverted. That is unnatural. It's not the way Jesus handled it. In the Garden of Gethsemane, what did he say? Father, let this cup pass from me. He was not unnatural. He was supernatural. But thy will be done, not mine. Lord, I don't want this. I'm not a masochist. I don't want to suffer. But if you know it's ultimately for your glory and my best interest and the good of others, give me the grace to accept it. That's supernatural. We're never called to be a natural. We're called to be supernatural. The joy of suffering, forget that stuff. It says in Hebrews that even if it is correction, at the time it's unpleasant. And affliction, that's crazy. There's no joy in suffering. There's joy despite suffering, but not from the suffering. Or I should say there's maybe joy in it, but not from it. That is despite it. A mother, and God bless her, the woman is a true prophetess of God, but on this point she makes mistakes. Mother Basilia Schlink. And again, she is a godly woman who loves Jesus very much. Those evangelical sisters are married, those Lutheran nuns, I would have to say they're some of the most Christ-like godly women I've ever met in my life. If there's anything that, like the women ministered to Jesus, they must be the closest thing to it. I have a high regard for these people. But on that particular point, I'm convinced she has it wrong. Now, affliction and correction. We're called to be supernatural, not unnatural. But let's go on now and explore this reason, this second reason, even further. The deeper theology of wickedness. We saw how Satan accuses Job. He accuses man, particularly God's man. But it begins where? Genesis 3:5. For God knows in the day you eat from it, your eyes will be opened, and you'll be like God, knowing good and evil. The accuser. The devil, Satan, accuses God to man. He accuses God to man. Second, as we saw in Job chapter 1, and in Job chapter 2, Satan accuses man to God. He accuses man to God. But let's look further. Isaiah 14:12-14. And we deal with the typology of this more on the Antichrist tapes. How you've fallen from heaven, O star of the morning, son of the dawn. See how he tries to imitate Jesus, the bright and morning star? You've been cut down to earth, you who have weakened the nations, but you said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. I will raise my throne above the stars of God and sit on the mount of the assembly in the recesses of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds and make myself like the Most High. He wants to be God. And the angels go in league with him, don't they? The fallen ones. We call demons Ezekiel 28:14-17. You were the anointed cherub who covers, and I placed you there. You were on the holy mountain of God. You walked in the midst of the stones of fire. You were blameless in your ways. From the day you were created until righteousness was found in you. Unrighteousness was then found in you. By the abundance of your trade you were internally filled with violence and you sinned. Therefore I have cast you as profane from the mountain of God, and I have destroyed you, O covering cherub. From the midst of the stones of fire your heart was lifted up because of your beauty. You corrupted your wisdom by reason of your splendor. I cast you to the ground. I put you before kings that they may see you. There he is, wanting to be God, across the Most High before the angels and then men. Satan accuses God. Zechariah chapter 3, verses 1 and 2. Let's look at it. He showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan standing at his right hand to accuse him. And the angel of the Lord here is the Metatron, Greek word meaning the one at the center of the throne. It's an Old Testament Christophany of apparition of Jesus. And the Lord said to Satan, the Lord rebuke you, Satan. What was he doing before the throne? Accusing. Same as in Job. Genesis. Satan accuses God to man. Job, he accuses man to God. Ezekiel, Isaiah, he accuses God before the angels and then to man. Zechariah, he accuses man to God. Revelation chapter 12, verse 10. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Messiah have come. For the accuser of our brethren has been thrown down. You see how that connects with Isaiah and Ezekiel? What is he doing? He's accusing. He accuses God to us and to angels, and he accuses us to angels and to God. And angels are always important. Remember, Jesus said, if you don't confess me before men, I will not confess you before my Father and his angels. They're witnesses. It's an oath. The accusation is not just before us, it's before angels. You understand? The accusation against God is not just before us, but before angels. And you see, it's the sons of men, the sons of God, rather, who come in Job, isn't it? The accusation of us is not just to God, it's before the angelic witnesses. They're the factors. The angels are always important in this. Separate subject. Maybe I should do a tape on angels someday. Nonetheless, let's look at it. So he's the accuser of the brethren. And Jesus is called our brother, isn't he? So he accuses God to man. Genesis. Man to God, Job. Accuses God to man, Isaiah, Ezekiel. Man to God, Zechariah. The accuser of the brethren in Revelation. He's brought accusations against God before the angels and before us. He's brought accusations against us before God and before the angels. The second reason God does not get rid of the devil today. Why? He will. Once the accusations have been proved false. Why is Satan bound 1,000 years of the millennia and let out? So there can never be a question as to the integrity of God. Oh, well, these people have never been tempted. They would reject you, these ones of the millennia. You've got me bound up down here, and I can't. You won't let me have my time to go speak to them or to do what I wanted. You won't let them hear your side of the story. That's the people who are in the millennia. Satan has to be released at the end for that same reason. You understand? The accusations of the accuser must be disproven before he's destroyed. It's not like you've insulted the king and you've accused the king falsely, so the king is going to kill you. The king is going to prove you're a liar, then he's going to kill you. God will vindicate his own integrity through his Son. But he will also vindicate those who repent through his Son. We are accused. He's the accuser of the brethren. The same as he accused Joshua and Zechariah, same as he accused Job, right now he's up there accusing you. He's accusing me. Right this minute he's up there accusing us. That's what he's doing. Walking around on the earth, finding everything wrong with us and bringing it upstairs and showing it to God and the angels. You see what they are? Only when God has vindicated his own name and the name of his sons will he destroy the enemy. That's why Satan has to be released at the end of the millennium. That's the second reason. Now we get into the deep things of Satan, as Jesus called it, in Freemasonry and witchcraft. There is a theosophy to it. Okay, would say a Satanist, and this, when you get into the higher degrees of Freemasonry, 32nd, 33rd degree, it's Luciferian. Pike admitted it himself. Well, we're made in God's image and likeness, Imagio Dei, there's good and evil in man, and if we are theopomorphic men made in His image and likeness, therefore there must be good and evil in God. The good and evil, the Yetzir HaTov and the Yetzir Hara within us, as Judaism would call it, is simply a reflection of the good and evil within God Himself. You understand? Now Mormonism picks up on this. You know that. God had two sons, one was Lucifer, the devil, the other was... Oh. And so therefore God has two sons, Jesus and the devil. That's why you see in the black mass, the rituals, everything is backwards, of like the cross is upside down, all this stuff. The reason they do that. Freemasonry gets into the same thing. How can you have hot without cold? How could you possibly define what was hot if you know what was cold? How could you define what was left if you didn't know what was right? How could you define what was north if you didn't know what was south? How could you define what was convex if you didn't know what was concave? How can you define it? You need evil to define what good is. Sounds quite logical. This is the deep things of Satan. And again, it's a perverted truth. The scriptures tell us there is no darkness in him. As we deal with on the Genesis 1, John 1, Proverbs 8 tape, man was to know evil existed. But he was not to know it within himself. He was told to subdue the earth. It wasn't fallen, but the serpent was already in the garden, wasn't he? The devil had already fallen in heaven, in other words. We were to know evil existed, but we were not to know it as part of our own nature. You were supposed to know what it was like to love your wife or your husband. You were not supposed to know what it was like to commit fornication. You were supposed to know what it was like to love your little baby without there ever being any possibility of hating somebody. But because of the fall of man, because we stupidly have affirmed the sin of Adam and Eve, and because we've inherited the sin of Adam and Eve, and again they get blamed for everything. Again, if God created you and your wife, or me and my wife, instead of Adam and Eve, we would have done the same thing. It's true to say that we can't know good for good's sake without having a point of reference to know what it isn't. But that's only because of the fall. We've lost our bearings only because of our fallen nature, you understand? The closest thing to describe what man was like before he fell, the closest thing you can look at that exists to teach what it was like as a little baby. Moral neutrality. You know what I'm saying? He doesn't know, or she doesn't know, good from evil, even though they're fallen themselves and they have a fallen nature. They still don't know good from evil in that sense. It's the closest thing to teach that we have that can teach us about what we would have been like, or what Adam and Eve were like before they ate of the tree of the world, the knowledge of good and evil. So therefore, the problem is not with evil, or with man, or even with the devil. The problem is with God, these people would say. How could God allow good to exist if he didn't allow evil? How can you possibly have good without evil? How can you possibly have love if you didn't have hate? There's good and evil in man, so there must be good and evil in God. There's good and evil in nature. There's flowers, and there's the spring, and there's the harvest. So therefore, and there's also earthquakes. So therefore, there's good and evil in nature, and God created it. There must be a reflection of himself. This is the theosophy on back of the higher degrees of Freemasonry. When you find how many people in the English-speaking world, and not only the English-speaking world, but particularly us in America and England, even Christians involved in these lodges with all this stupid stuff, it's absolutely reprehensible. This is the philosophy of the world. It is a false theodicy. You understand? Witchcraft, Satanism, Freemasonry try to explain theodicy that way. Now they do this by rites of initiation. Again, it has the Gnostic element in it where you have to get initiated to understand these things and so on, and to the higher degree and all this stuff, then you become a master and all this stuff. And Freemasonry is rife with Gnostic influence. We deal with that again on other tapes. But that is a false theodicy. Biblical theodicy, the second point then, is the accuser must be proved to be a liar before God will remove him. So vindicate himself and his elect before the accuser is finally and ultimately destroyed. Let's get to the third and main reason. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. Your God is the true God. The devil's the God of this world. Why doesn't your God get rid of him? Okay, I can see what you're saying. Don't blame my God. My God wasn't responsible for Dunblane. My God's not responsible for Rwanda. My God is not responsible for Cambodia. It's the God of this world. But why doesn't your God get rid of the God of this world? Okay. So God has been accused, and man has been accused, and God is going to vindicate himself. But certainly God can vindicate himself just by showing up. Why doesn't he do it? Why does he allow these children to die? All right. So your God is using evil even to make you more like Jesus and to deal with the things that are wrong in your life and to help you not to trust in this fallen world. All right. But why doesn't he just come back and put an end to it? Why put you through the misery? Why is he allowing this to go on? Why doesn't he come and destroy Satan? Why doesn't he do it now? Matthew 13:24-30. And he presented them another parable, saying, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while men were sleeping, his enemy came and sowed tares also among the wheat, and went away. But the wheat sprang up and bore grain, and the tares became evident also. And the slave said to the landowner, Sir, did you not know how good seed in your sow good seed in your field? How then is it you have tares? And he said to them, an enemy's done this. And the slaves told him, do you want us then to go and gather them up? But he said, no, lest while you are gathering up the tares, you may root up the wheat with them. Allow both to grow until the harvest. And in the time of the harvest I will say to the reapers, first gather up the tares and bind them in bundles to burn them up, but gather the wheat into my barn. Here we have, again, another major error, the error of Augustine, who goofed up and screwed up Christianity worse than anybody else who ever was.